Good afternoon, everyone, to Esther Lesson 3. Before we get started, we're just going to do a really quick review so we can kind of get this timeline straight in our heads. In chapter 1, this was the third year of King Xerxes' reign. So he'd been in power for about 3 years. We know he displayed his riches and his splendor, and there were 2 different banquets. We talked about that earlier. And this is when Queen Vashti was removed as queen. And then in chapter 2, this is the 7th year. So there's 4 years between chapter 1 and chapter 2. So this was the 7th year of King Xerxes' reign, and this is when Esther was made queen. And not only was Esther made queen, but her uncle, Mordecai, his name was written in the Chronicles, which was a history book of everything that happened for all of the kings. In chapter 3, we see another big 5-year jump because this is now the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign. So now he and Queen Esther had been married somewhere between 4 and 5 years. And this is when we see Haman plotting to destroy the Jews, that pogrom that we talked about last week. In chapter 4, Mordecai implored Esther to go to the king. And she was really afraid, and she had every right to be afraid. I mean, if she was going to be the one who went to the king and attempted to save her people, if he didn't raise his scepter to her, she was going to die, and then she still wouldn't be there to save her people. And so this is when Mordecai says his famous quote that's quoted so often, "Who's to say that you did not attain royalty for such a time as this?" And Esther, that kind of woke her up, and she told Mordecai to have the Jews there in Susa to fast and pray for 3 days. And in the beginning of chapter 5, we only have a little tiny time leap for 3 days. Now we're at the end, and Esther is going before the king. Now, the protocol to see the king was, if you walked in because you had not been invited and he raised his scepter, you would be saved. He, would say, "Come on in, let's talk about whatever you wanted to talk about." But if he did not raise his scepter, you would immediately be killed. So Esther went in full of faith after fasting and praying for 3 days with her people, and she walked into his court. And of course, we know that King Xerxes raised his scepter. Why? What would make him raise his scepter to her? Well, in chapter 2, verses 9, 15, and 17, we're told that she was favored above all others. And then in chapter 2, verse 17, we see that King Xerxes also loved her above all others. And so the king asked a very poignant question. What do you want? You can have half of my kingdom. And instead of asking for the life of her people, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Now, this is the 4th banquet we've seen, so hopefully you're keeping up with that on your banquets chart. We had the first one that lasted 6 months in chapter 1. We also saw in chapter 1 the 7-day banquet, and then we saw in chapter 2 the banquet that the king threw for Esther when he made her queen. And now this is the 4th banquet, which is when the king and Haman were invited by Esther. Now there's a big key phrase that's repeated here. It's repeated all through this entire book, and it's the phrase, "if it pleases the king." We see it in chapter 5, verses 4 and 8, and we see it again in chapter 7, verse 3. But who else was pleased? Haman. Haman was really happy. And we see that in verses 9 and verse 14. Now, why do you think that Esther did not immediately tell the king everything? He told her, "I'll give you half my kingdom." So why didn't he say, "Okay, give me half your kingdom and I'll move all my people into that half of the kingdom, and then they'll be spared. They're not going to be killed. They'll be okay." Because through fasting and praying, God gave her a plan. And I thoroughly believe, and there's no doubt in my mind, that this plan that she executed was exactly done the way that God had told her to do it. She showed a lot of restraint, a lot of patience, and a lot of humility toward the king. And she also exhibited a lot of wisdom by listening and obeying really good advice. Started out with Mordecai. She didn't tell anyone she was a Jew. She did not tell anyone that she was part of his family. And she went to the king. Haggai, way back in chapter 2 that we saw, chapter 2, told her that when you go to see the king, only take certain things. And that's all she took. Everybody, every other girl grabbed as much stuff as she possibly could to take it on with her to the second harem. But Esther didn't. So through fasting and prayer, God gave her a plan that made absolutely zero sense. And then we see Haman. Haman was so excited to not only be invited to one, but to two private parties with none other than the king and the queen. He was so happy and so full of himself. But as soon as he walked out of that gate, he saw Mordecai. And scripture tells us his happiness turned to rage because Mordecai refused to bow. Now, what I find kind of odd about this is nowhere in scripture do we see that Mordecai and Haman actually ever have a conversation. Mordecai never said anything to Haman. Haman never said anything to Mordecai. And Haman is really walking on cloud nine right now. He's a second in the kingdom. He's about to get exactly what he wanted. These Jewish people are about to be completely annihilated and destroyed in less than a year. But then he looks at one thing, at Mordecai, and suddenly his happiness is turned to rage. That's what I call Haman vision. He had all of these blessings, all of these wonderful things in his mind going on in his life. And he chose not to look at probably the tens, if not 20s, 30s, 50s, hundreds of people that are bowing down before him on a daily basis just because he walks by them or just because he sees them. And he chooses not to look at the blessing, but he turns to look at the one thing that builds up unexplainable rage. That's Haman vision. So he gets home and he builds himself up before his friends and his wife, and he starts displaying his fortune just like the king did in chapter 1. He was very prideful, and pride, the idolatrous worship of self. He was inconsolable. I think he was kind of insane myself. And so they make a suggestion to make him feel better. And the suggestion wasn't, hey, Haman, honey, look at all the blessings you have. Look, you have me, your wife, you have friends, you have a home, you have power, you have prestige, you have position. You need to start looking at all of your blessings. But that's not what they told him. To make him feel better, they continued to indulge his Haman vision and said, go to the king and kill Mordecai. Go hang him high. Now, gallows are not what we see like in Western movies. I'm a huge fan of Westerns, but it's not what they say. In this case, and it's about to get kind of graphic here for just a second, it was a tree. And in this case, a 75-foot tree. And it was bent over and it was secured, like tacked to the ground. Then they would take the person, and the person was, for lack of a better word, they were shoved onto this tree and secured to it in such a way that when the tree was released, gravity would take over and the person would slide down the tree, slowly being impaled by it. This was a very slow, very torturous, very painful way to die. And with Mordecai being 75 feet high, not only would he be seen, but his screams of agony would have carried and been heard throughout the entire kingdom. That's gruesome. And so extreme was Haman's hatred that every good thing in his life was marred and defined and distorted by that hatred of a man who never said a word to him. So then in chapter 6, we see the king. And guys, chapter 6, I love chapter 6. Chapter 6, just, it's so funny. I hope you guys just laughed at what happened. But in chapter 6, the king has insomnia. He's a little, he can't sleep very well. And he asked for one of the books of the Chronicles to be brought in and read to him. Now, these books of Chronicles were left in a like a library. So there would have been hundreds, probably thousands, many thousands of these scrolls, these chronicles of history for every king, Persian, Medo-Persian king in history. So these were huge chronicles. And so just so happened that the one scroll from this huge, vast library that was brought to him was the one that recorded Mordecai saving his life from the plot of the murderers, the assassins, that we saw in chapter 2, verses 21 to 23. So this was read to the king. So the king asked, a fair question. He said, well, has any honor been bestowed to this man? I mean, there hadn't been. This is years later, at least 5 years. And this reading must have taken quite a while to read through this entire scroll. And it didn't help the king's insomnia, because obviously the king is still awake, because now it's morning. And who happens to have just walked in the castle but Haman? And Haman, with his Haman vision, was going to talk to the king about hanging Mordecai to make him feel better. But before Haman could even say a word, the king rushes up to him, having been told he was in the castle, and he asks a crazy question. He said, hey, Haman, how should a man be honored by the king? Now, Haman automatically assumes that the king's talking to him, because who else would the king want to honor, right? I mean, except his second man, his number 2, his most trusted confidant. So Haman, only thinking that this is him, gives the king a rather royal list. And he says, well, let's give that man a royal robe. And let's give him a king's horse. And let's put a crown on his head. Let's adorn him. But not just for there, not just to walk around the castle. No, that's not good enough. Let's parade him through the streets and have somebody standing in front of him, calling out to everyone who can hear, this is what's done to the man the king honors. King thinks it over. It's an amazing idea. He likes it. He's getting excited. So he tells Haman to do all those things. Don't leave anything out. Make sure exactly, dude, you've got the best plan ever. Go do that to Mordecai. To who? You mean Haman? No. I mean Mordecai. That man that sits out on the gate that you hate so bad that he dared to walk into the castle and ask the king to kill him. The gallows were built. They were waiting for him. Can you imagine the absolute humiliation that Haman was feeling? I personally think it's hilarious, because now Mordecai is on the horse. And Haman is parading him through the streets, saying, "This is what is done to the man the king honors." Not the man pulling the horse, the man sitting on it. And I think if Haman had his way, he probably would have preferred to be behind the horse picking up after it than in the front, declaring his mortal enemy to be someone that is being honored by the king. I bet the 12th day of the 12th month couldn't come soon enough for Haman and his Haman vision. But in verse 12, we see something pretty interesting. Mordecai had just been honored in a way that we don't see anyone in Scripture ever being honored. And when it was done, there wasn't a banquet. He didn't go to a banquet. He didn't, raise his stature or his position in the castle at all. When he was done, he went back out of the gate and he sat down. Because just because he was elevated to a high honor, it never changed his circumstances. And that's Mordecai vision. That's where pride doesn't stay in the way. He didn't continue to walk around town talking about how wonderful he was and how honored he was that the king honored him. That wasn't Mordecai vision. Mordecai vision was, yeah, that was nice. I got to ride around. Okay, Haman was embarrassed a little bit, but you know what? I'm going back outside and I'm going to go sit at the gate because I know that pogrom is coming and I will be massacred with all of my people. That's Mordecai vision. Now, I wonder how hard it was for Mordecai, after being honored, not to tell the king what Haman had planned. I also wonder how hard it was for the Jewish people to see Haman brought down a couple notches, which would have made him very happy, to see a Jew on the back of the horse being honored. I wondered how hard it was for the crowd not to just gang up on Haman and kill him. It couldn't have been easy. In chapter 4, we see that Mordecai mourned. And in chapter 6, we see that Haman mourned. But their mourning is not the same. In chapter 4, with Mordecai vision, Mordecai mourned for his people. He mourned for their death. And his mourning brought him down in humility. He humbled himself before God in sackcloth and ashes, praying and begging for the life of his people. Haman only mourned because his pride was hurt. Nothing else. And Haman's position wasn't changed either. As soon as Mordecai climbed off that horse and went back to sit at the gate, Haman was elevated. His position never changed either. But it didn't make a difference to him. And now he mourned. And this time when Haman went back to his friends and his family, boy, what a difference 24 hours made, right? Because now instead of telling him, hang Mordecai, hang him, you're great, you're wonderful, look at everything that you've got. Instead, his wife, Zeresh, looks at him and says, you know what, hon? You're actually going to be thrown over or overcome by Mordecai. Not because he's smarter, not because he has an army, not because he has more money. You're going to be overcome and overthrown by Mordecai for one reason and one reason only. And that reason is he's a Jew. And while Haman is walking around with his hands over his face, absolutely humiliated and embarrassed, the king's eunuchs show up and quickly escort him out to a banquet. So the king arrives at this banquet and he asks Queen Esther for the third time what she wanted. And for the third time, he offered her up to half the kingdom. He says, what's your petition and what's your request? Now's the time. I can see God whispering in her ear, go. For such a time as this, go. And Esther started, if it pleases the king, the petition is for my life, and the quest is for the life of my people. Excuse me. She says, King, if they were just going to be sold into slavery, I wouldn't have said anything. Because who knows? Maybe they'd have prospered where they were going. Maybe they'd have been better off. He said, but I wouldn't have even bothered the king if all that was happening was that they were being sold off. But that's not what's going on. King, they're going to be massacred. Now, did Esther tell the king who her people are? No. The king still doesn't know that this pogrom, this annihilation, this destruction is for the Jews. But now we have a problem. Because now who actually does know Esther's true heritage? Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And why Haman chose that point to be quiet, to not say a word, to not look at the king and point and say, see, these people, these usurpers, these horrible people, look, they even, they tricked the king into choosing one of them for their queen so she could be in here, so she could be part of it. And I don't know if the king probably maybe would have believed him, or at least may have had to, think really hard about it. But he chose this time to keep his mouth shut. Because when the king heard what Haman was planning, he says he left. He left in an absolute rage. He went to go walk it off. He had to go think about it. He didn't want to do this knee-jerk reaction and just do nothing about it. He had to think. He was mad. He had to go. And that left Haman and Esther. And Haman begged Esther for his life. And I don't know if he was begging and his hands might have been around her legs and he was on the ground just begging, or if he was shaking her and begging her. We don't know, but we know that the king picked that point to come back, and he thought Haman was actually assaulting the king. And you gotta love this eunuch. He goes up to the king and he says, hey, king, Haman actually has a gallows already built. You don't even have to build them. You don't have to wait till morning. You don't have to think about it. Haman already built them. And he was going to kill Mordecai with it. You remember that man that was on a horse, like, earlier today. And so Haman was taken away and hanged on his own gallows. Even though God is never mentioned, we see his hand throughout the entire Esther narrative. What some may read as consequence, we openly acknowledge as God. So I want you to really think and pray about, and if you want to share, you can write it in the comments down below the video, the answer to this question. Have I been born and reborn and brought through all of my experiences for such a time as this? When there was a point in your life that this, why is this happening, turned into such a time as this? Now, I shared with the live group, the Zoom group. So I'll just share real quick, just one of the times I shared two, but I'll share just one. And the one I'll share is this. Oscar, when as an adult in his 40s, decided to go back to school. And we had all 6 of our children, and I was homeschooling them. So I didn't work outside the home. So he worked jobs, and he went back to school for 2 years to earn his first of 3 different degrees that he ended up getting. After he graduated, #1 in his class, straight A's, he couldn't find a job in his field. He worked for the hospital for a little while, in their IT department, and then that was really just not going anywhere. And so he was offered a job working in the registrar's office of Fairmont State. Now, we had student loans to pay. We had 6 kids to feed. I wasn't working, and this job was not the best ever in the world, but he took it in Fairmont State. About 2 months later, April 15th, my dad had a horrible airplane accident, and ended up being life flighted to Ruby. He was there for a few weeks, and then we were looking for a nursing home where he could go in and be rehabbed. He had multiple surgeries, and think, in the tens of surgeries. And he ended up, there was nothing local, nothing close. He ended up in a nursing home in Fairmont that just so happened to have a room, and he was, the orders were he was not to have a roommate. They moved a bed in there, and my mom literally moved into the nursing home with my father. Now, they had animals, they had a house, they had a huge farm that the kids and I and Oscar would go take care of. But this nursing home where my father ended up was in Fairmont. Oscar could leave the registrar's office, walk to his car, get in his car, drive to the nursing home, park, and walk into my father's room in 10 minutes. And so when my mom needed anything, when she needed laundry done, Oscar would go pick them up, bring them home. I'd wash them. He'd bring them back. My mom was a deacon in her church at the time. So when they had a deacon's meeting once a month, Oscar would go after work, sit with my father. Mom would drive in to Salem and have her deacon meeting, drive back to Fairmont, and Oscar would come home. Made very, very, very long days for Oscar, but he did them. And we were grateful to be in that position to be able to do that. My father came home the end of June. Just a very few weeks later, Oscar got a job in his field working for an amazing company. And I tell him that his hours were my favorite ever. Coincidence? Nah. God. We didn't know and we didn't understand why my husband, who had straight A student, top of his class, #1, could not get a job in his field anywhere that was supposed to be wide open. Why is he now working in a registrar's office? It didn't benefit him. Believe me, the money was terrible. And we still had children, and I still didn't have a job, and it was hard. It was rough. Why? For such a time as this. Because even before Oscar thought about going back to work, going back to school probably 3 years before, God knew what Oscar needed. And God knew that Dad would need him there. And so Oscar was. And when it was over, he got a job that he really loved. And we were blessed by that job for years. And so I know that if you think and if you pray, so many of you have had life experiences where the why this is happening turned into such a time as this. And I'd really, really love to hear about it in the comments below. Now, this is all we have for this week. Next week is our very last Esther lesson, our lesson number 4, where we see what happens. Because remember, the pogrom is still going on. It can't be undone. It can't be changed. So now what? It's a really exciting ending. And God's hand just moves in amazing and miraculous ways. And we'll get into that next week. So until then, I hope to see those of you who are attending Horizons. I hope to see you in church on Sunday. And for those who aren't, I want to bid you Shalom Aleichem. Peace to all of you. Shavua Tov. Have a great week. Bye-bye.